I didn't expect to cry at the end of the Disappearance of Susan Cox Powell documentary, but I did. This is a documentary of 2 halves. It's a 2-parter. I believe each part is about an hour and a half. It's very in-depth. There's a lot of detail. But the first half is quite dull and not that great. The second half is very powerful and frustrating. Some of the frustrations are because of the power of the storytelling, some not so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the documentary itself and, the things that I thought could have been done better. And then I will talk about things that the documentary presented to us and my thoughts on those aspects of this true crime case. But basically, if you don't know, Susan Cox Powell went missing in 2009. And to this day, her body has never been found. But this documentary does give us... It gives us answers. I'll say that. And I should also say I hadn't heard of this case before. So in terms of making me feel like I'm completely informed about everything that we as the public are allowed to know about this, I feel like this covers all bases, and in terms of telling the story, it does very well. I guess the things that I didn't like, there weren't that many things that I didn't like about it. I will say the first half was very slow, not very interesting, not a lot happened, it repeated a lot of the same information. But if you sit through it and get to the second part, it's actually, you can see why that information was important. So the things that I didn't like. First of all, I liked the fact that Stephanie Bauer was presenting this. I hadn't heard of her, but I liked her style. I liked the fact that she wasn't smiling through the entire thing. You get some true crime presenters or investigators who just keep smiling when they're talking about these brutal crimes, and she doesn't do that. She's got a very neutral expression that I really appreciated. Her tone of voice was spot on. But the fact that she was sitting down in front of a camera and directly addressing the camera made it feel like she was making a YouTube video. It had that kind of cheap, amateur, but very high definition kind of feel to it. And I just think that was a really poor choice from the production aspect. But, it's not a massive deal. The other thing is that on a couple of occasions, not that frequently, they used some voice altering on a witness who obviously wanted to remain anonymous. And the voice altering was awful. So bad. To the point where I couldn't really understand what they were saying. And I've never experienced voice altering that's actually been bad before, but this was basically... I couldn't hear any of it. Completely inaudible. Or rather unintelligible. But aside from that, other than the first half being a bit slow, the second half is very powerful. It utilises a lot of footage from the time. Obviously, this was a big investigation. I think it spanned over... I can't really say... I don't want to say too much about what happened at this moment. I will talk about specific, shall I say, spoilers that I hadn't expected because I wasn't aware of this case. I'll talk about those soon, but I'll save those to the end in case you want to go in with this with no knowledge, which is what I did. And that's why the second half was so powerful, because that's when the shocking elements started to come into this and things about the case that I had not expected. And that's why it was powerful. But the first half, I'm just going to forget now. The second half really utilised a lot of home videos, and home videos taken both by her father-in-law, by herself. Weirdly, the one where she speaks, the one where she's saying, I'm doing this in case anything happens to me or my family, I kind of thought, do you mean my family as in your husband and your children, or your family as in your parents, etc.? Because if she meant just her children, she would have said me and my children. So I thought it was an interesting choice of words that the documentary never kind of really looked at. Just with the choice of words, it could have meant that her own suspicions were pointing towards maybe somebody who wasn't her husband. But I'm sure they investigated that, or at least tried to analyse her choice of words at some point. We have a lot of, clips from people speaking at the time, but we also, of course, have a lot of interviews with mainly her father, but also Josh's relatives, Josh being her husband. And his relatives are in a very different frame of mind from one another. The main daughter, whose name I can't remember, I apologise for not writing it down. But she was the one who was very emotionally affected by this, and I thought she spoke so eloquently and so professionally, and I can't imagine the pain that she went through with this. Those shots were very well framed. I think there were enough of them peppered throughout that I felt like we were getting, a genuine overview of how it affected her and what her thoughts were, without feeling like they were utilising it too much. I will say, this is a pretty unbiased documentary, in the sense that it presents all of the facts, and it just so happens that the facts all kind of point at the same thing, and it does offer some theories, but it doesn't say this is what happened. And I can't work out what their intention was when they provided the clips and the interviews with the other daughter, Alina Powell, who is the most in denial person I've ever heard of. And in a sense, I don't blame her. She's been brought up by this sleazy, disgusting father who was Susan Cox Powell's father-in-law, and is basically brainwashed. And she doesn't believe her brother Josh would do anything. She doesn't believe her father would do anything. And it's a shame. I don't think she did anything. I don't think she has anything to do with it. But the fact that she's completely in denial is just a bit heartbreaking, really. But that's usually what happens when you're a victim, and she obviously doesn't see that. But I don't know what they were trying to do with that. Obviously, as I said, it's pretty unbiased, but I don't know if they were trying to make the public think that she'd been brainwashed, thus giving more ammunition for thinking that her father was guilty. I don't know, but it was very frustrating when she kept just denying everything and saying that her brother was innocent and all that rubbish. One thing that also really annoyed me, not about the documentary, but about what happened at the time, is the clip where the supervisor is stuck outside the house and Josh won't let her in, and she's on the phone to the dispatcher, and she gives all of the information, and then the dispatcher's like, whose house is it? And she gives the name, and it's like, what's the surname? And she says, and she says, what's the first name? She's already said this, and who are you? So it's not your house. And he was like, the point was like, but you can't supervise yourself. And I'm just thinking, did you not listen to the call? Are you not paying attention? This is a woman in distress. If you're going to be a dispatcher, you have to be able to have the skill of listening and paying attention. Maybe it was their first day on the job. I don't know. But it very much frustrated me. They clearly didn't grasp the gravitas of this situation. Not that I think it would have made any difference. I think even if they'd been able to have officers and fire engines there within seconds, I don't think it would have made a difference to the outcome. And this is where the spoilers, if you like, will come in. I'm about to say what happened 3 years after Susan disappeared. So, as we know, Josh Powell decided to take his own life, and in doing so he also took the life of the two young children. One was 5, I think the other one was slightly younger, and first of all, he never should have had supervised visits. If he was, the case is complicated because he wasn't a suspect in the sense that he was going to be arrested, he was going to be in custody. They didn't really have anything on him, even though, well, I'll talk about the other thing in a moment. But he still shouldn't have had supervised visits at his home. They gave a reason for it, but it still shouldn't have happened. But under no circumstances is what he did is excusable. He's saying he couldn't live without his sons, and so he was going to kill himself. And then, well, if you love your sons so much that you can't live without them, why would you violently set them on fire and also axe them? It did mention that they had also been brutally beaten just before the house was burned down. Clearly, it was a case of, if I can't have them, nobody can. And I'm wondering if that's the same mentality he had with Susan Cox Powell. The documentary didn't ever kind of touch upon that, The documentary said, the reason the documentary gave, if he did kill her, was that he didn't want a messy divorce. He wanted to do it his way. And he was going to just kill her because he didn't want, the issues of going through the divorce. But I think it is a mentality of, the world revolves around me. If I can't have the people I love or loved, then nobody can. And that's, I kind of get, I feel like he got wind of what his father was doing with Susan. His father, Steve, was very much infatuated with Susan, as I'm sure you know by this point. And I don't know if Josh thought that Susan was maybe going to leave him to be with his father. I highly doubt that would have ever happened. But I think maybe it was just too much for him to handle, seeing them even flirting or being in the same room together. And he thought, well, just in case she leaves me or he takes her away from me, I'll get rid of her. Nobody can have her if I can't. And for me, that's clearly what happened. Now, at the end, it showed a journal, Steve's journal, her father-in-law, Josh's father, that confessed. It said something like, Josh did a terrible thing last night, such and such. I believe he will take her to such and such a place and cremate her. Steve wrote that in writing, and that's a confession that he knew that Josh had killed her. It's there in black and white or whatever. And I don't know why that's never really been kind of focused on a lot more. Now, obviously, they're all dead. Everyone's dead. It's the situation they're in now, and it's absolutely horrible. So nobody will ever be able to confess or be convicted. Steve was in prison, but it's not really the same as proving that he had anything to do with it. He was in prison for several other very disgusting, creepy reasons. It's a difficult case because at the moment, I don't know if it's actually classed as a cold case or a closed case, because to me that journal is black and white. And it wasn't written, after the fact. It was written either the day or the day after it happened. Unless Steve did it and he wrote that in his journal to frame his son in case the police ever went and looked at his journal and they'd see that Steve wrote that. And I don't know, it's very complicated, and I feel for the family who will never get concrete answers. There's a lot of speculation, but they'll never know the real truth. And 12 years later, give or take, and no body. It's unlikely that they'll ever find a body in this lifetime. Maybe they will. And what happened to those two boys was completely avoidable. That could have been avoided, and it should have been avoided. If Josh was a suspect at all, even if there wasn't enough evidence to convict him, there was enough evidence to show that he couldn't care for those boys. He is allowed visitation rights. It should not have been in his own home. They should never have allowed that. So the second half of the documentary is difficult to watch because it's so well done. Starting to well up a bit now. I was perfectly fine until we got to the bit about the children, because as I said, I knew nothing about this case whatsoever. So I didn't know Josh killed himself. I didn't know he took the children with him. I didn't know anything. And it took me by surprise a lot. And I just can't get over it. If you like true crime, you need to watch this. Power through the first half. It's a good foundation for the second half, but it's very dry and monotonous and a little bit painful to sit through. But power through it. It'll help you kind of understand the second half a lot more. The second half is a brilliantly produced documentary that's very powerful. A great storytelling episode that ultimately helps to keep Susan Cox Powell's name out there. Yes, it doesn't really help to solve the crime now, because everybody who could have been involved, or those who were suspected, are now dead. But maybe it'll jog somebody's memory. Maybe somebody knew something. But either way, it's difficult to watch. Also, I can't believe there was no CCTV of, them leaving the house for the last time, or Josh leaving the house on his own, maybe with a big bag or something. The documentary didn't mention any of that. I assume it doesn't exist. It's a powerful, powerful documentary, absolutely worth the watch. Heartbreaking, moving, but necessary.